sweep across the earth and conquer all!
On a spring day in 210 BC, a convoy of carriages rumbled across the dusty roads of eastern China. It was no ordinary procession. It was the imperial entourage of the most powerful man on earth, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the man who had unified China's warring kingdoms into a single empire, the man who had built the first Great Wall, the man who had standardized riding, weights, measures, and even the width of cart axles across his vast domain. He was returning from an inspection tour of his empire, and inside his ornate carriage, behind silk curtains and armed guards, the emperor lay dead. He had been dead for days. The smell was becoming a problem. The summer heat was not kind to corpses, even the corpse of the Son of Heaven. But his closest advisor, a scheming eunuch and a corrupt chancellor, were not about to announce the death. Not yet. There was too much at stake, a power vacuum at the heart of the empire, rivals to be eliminated, a succession to be manipulated. So they kept the emperor's death as secret. They continued to deliver meals to his carriage. They continued to relay his fake orders, and to mask the stench of decay, they loaded a cart with rotting fish and drove it directly in front of the imperial procession. For weeks, the most powerful man in the world was a decomposing corpse, propped up by lies, followed by the stink of dead fish. When they finally arrived back at the capital, the conspiracy was complete. The emperor's body was buried in a vast underground mausoleum, a tomb so grand it contained rivers of mercury, flowing mechanically through a miniature replica of his empire. And the cause of his death, the thing that had killed the immortal emperor of China at the age of 49, was the very thing he had taken to prevent his death. He had been drinking mercury, on purpose, for years. Qin Shi Huang was not alone. He was not an isolated madman with a peculiar taste for poison. He was participating in a tradition that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries more. Across the ancient world, from the palaces of China to the temples of India, from the alchemical laboratories of medieval Europe to the secret chambers of the Egyptian pharaohs, the most brilliant, powerful, and wealthy men in human history were deliberately consuming one of the most toxic substances on the periodic table. They mixed it into elixir. They drank it like wine. They swallowed pills of it. And they did so because they believed, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that it would make them live forever. Today, we are going to explore one of the strangest, most fascinating, and most tragic chapters in the history of human stupidity and human hope, the story of why ancient emperors drank toxic mercury elixirs to live forever. It is a story about the fear of death, the lust for power, and the terrible price of believing too hard in something that is not true. It is a story that will make you grateful for modern medicine and terrified of what people will swallow if you promise them immortality. Part 2: The First Emperor and His Quest for Eternity. Let us return to Qin Shi Huang, because his story is the perfect starting point. To understand why he drank mercury, you have to understand who he was. He was born in Shang, a prince of the state of Qin, one of the 7 warring kingdoms that had been battling for control of China for over 2 centuries. He became king at the age of 13. By the age of 38, he had conquered all 6 rival kingdoms and declared himself the first emperor of a unified China. He was a man of extraordinary energy and vision. He built a network of roads and canals. He built the precursor to the Great Wall, forcing hundreds of thousands of laborers to connect and extend the existing fortifications. He burned books and buried scholars alive to suppress dissenting ideas. He survived multiple assassination attempts, including one where an assassin got close enough to strike at him with a poisoned dagger and almost succeeded. This man, who had faced death so many times and once, developed a consuming obsession with living forever. He had conquered everything in the material world. There was only one enemy left: death itself. The emperor summoned the greatest scholars, doctors, and alchemists in his empire and gave them a mission: find the secret of immortality. He sent expeditions across the eastern sea to search for the fabled Isle of the Immortals, Pingwai, where legend said the elixir of life could be found. One of these expeditions, led by a court sorcerer named Su Fu, took a fleet of ships and thousands of young men and women and sailed into the Pacific Ocean. They never returned. Some historians believe they settled in Japan. The emperor waited. He grew older. He grew more desperate. And his alchemists, terrified of failing the most dangerous client in human history, began to experiment. They turned to the ancient Taoist traditions of alchemy, which held that certain substances contained the essence of eternal life. Gold, for example, was the perfect metal. It never tarnished. It never rusted. It never decayed. If you could ingest gold, wouldn't you absorb its immortal properties? But gold is inert and passes through the body without doing much of anything. The alchemists needed something more potent. They found it in cinnabar, Cinnabar is a beautiful mineral. It is a deep, vivid red, the color of blood and fire. It had been used for centuries as a pigment, a dye, a ritual substance in burials, and cinnabar is mercury sulfide. When heated, it releases pure, liquid mercury. The alchemists of ancient China became fascinated with mercury. Look at its properties. It is a liquid metal, shimmering and alive, flowing like water but dense like stone. It breaks apart into tiny, perfectly round beads and then reforms into a single pool. It seems to have a life of its own. To the ancient mind, mercury was not just a metal. It was a magical substance, a bridge between the material and the spiritual worlds. The Taoist alchemists believed that by refining and consuming mercury, they could absorb its transformative power and achieve physical immortality. They developed elaborate recipes for elixirs of life, mixtures of mercury, cinnabar, gold, and various herbs, boiled, distilled, and prepared according to secret formulas. Qin Shi Huang drank these elixirs eagerly. His doctors told him they would extend his life, perhaps forever. What they actually gave him was a cocktail of heavy metals that was systematically destroying his brain, his kidneys, and his liver. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning are horrific and ironic: insomnia, irritability, tremor, memory loss, a metallic taste in the mouth, hallucinations, paranoia. The very symptoms the elixirs were supposed to prevent, the decay of the mind and body, were being accelerated by the elixirs themselves. The emperor, in his desperate quest for immortality, was poisoning himself to death. When he died in 210 BC, his body was already ravaged by years of mercury toxicity. His famous tomb, which has still not been fully excavated, was booby-trapped with crossbows and surrounded by a moat of mercury. A final, ironic tribute to the substance that killed him. Modern soil tests around the tomb site have revealed mercury concentrations up to 40 times higher than normal, confirming the ancient accounts that the tomb contains rivers of the liquid metal. Even in death, the first emperor was surrounded by his poison. 12-0-22-0. Part 3: The alchemical tradition from China to the West. The first emperor was the most famous victim of mercury elixirs, but he was far from the first or the last. The Taoist alchemical tradition, known as Weidan or external alchemy, flourished in China for over 1,000 years after his death. The fundamental belief was simple and seductive. The human body is a microcosm of the universe. The forces that govern the cosmos also govern the body. Just as base metals can be transmuted into gold through alchemical processes, the mortal body can be transmuted into an immortal body through the consumption of alchemically prepared substances. Gold and cinnabar were the two most important. Gold for its incorruptibility, cinnabar for its transformative fire. The alchemists wrote elaborate texts, filled with cryptic diagrams and poetic language, describing the processes of refining these substances into elixirs of immortality. They used specialized furnaces, crucibles, and distillation equipment. They timed their operations according to astrological alignments. They recited incantations and performed purification rituals. This was not seen as crude chemistry. It was sacred science. The quest for immortality was a spiritual practice as much as a material one. The elixir, when perfected, would not just prevent death, it would transform the body into light, allowing the adept to ascend to the heavens and join the immortals in their celestial paradise. The problem, of course, is that the elixirs were deadly poison. The Tang Dynasty, often considered the golden age of Chinese civilization, was particularly enthusiastic about mercury elixirs. Emperor after emperor succumbed to the lure of immortality. Tang Taizong, one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, a brilliant general and administrator who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, died after consuming elixirs prepared by Buddhist monks and Taoist alchemists. Tang Xianzong, another Tang emperor, became obsessed with alchemy in his later years. He grew increasingly paranoid and erratic, symptoms of mercury poisoning, and eventually died after taking a longevity medicine that triggered a violent and fatal reaction. Tang Muzong, his son, learned nothing from his father's death. He also took elixirs and also died young. Tang Wuzong, another Tang emperor, took elixirs and died at the age of 32. Tang Xuanzong, the last significant Tang emperor, you guessed it, took elixirs and died. The pattern was so consistent that it became a grim joke among court historians. Emperor seeks immortality. Emperor finds alchemist. Alchemist prepares mercury elixir. Emperor drinks it. Emperor dies. Next emperor repeats the process. Why did these brilliant, educated, powerful men keep drinking poison? The answer is partly psychological. The fear of death is the most fundamental human fear. It drives everything we do, from religion to medicine to the pursuit of fame and status. For an emperor, The fear was magnifying. They had everything: absolute power, unimaginable wealth, the adoration of millions, and they knew that they would lose it all. Death was the great equalizer, the one enemy that could not be conquered by armies or bribed with treasure. The alchemists offered hope, and the human capacity for hope, especially when it comes to escaping death, is almost infinite. Even the smartest people can convince themselves of things they desperately want to believe. The emperors were also surrounded by enablers. Their courts were filled with ambitious men who knew that telling the emperor what he wanted to hear was the path to riches and influence. If the emperor believed in Mercury Elixirs, who were they to contradict him? The alchemists themselves were often true believers. They were not consciously peddling poison. They genuinely believed in the transformative power of their concoctions. They tested them on animals and sometimes on themselves, noting the initial effects: a warming sensation, a feeling of energy, a flush of the skin, and interpreting these as signs that the elixir was working. Mercury poisoning can initially produce a feeling of stimulation before it begins to destroy the body. The alchemists, seeing the early effects and attributing later deaths to other causes, maintained their faith. The tradition of alchemical elixirs was not confined to China. It spread along the Silk Road to India, the Middle East, and eventually to medieval Europe. In India, the tradition of Rasa Shastra, the science of mercury, became an important branch of Ayurvedic medicine. Indian alchemists believed that mercury, properly purified and processed, was the seed of the god Shiva, and could confer immortality and spiritual liberation. They developed elaborate techniques for killing mercury, treating it with various herbs and minerals to remove its toxicity while preserving its spiritual potency. Whether these techniques actually worked is a matter of fierce debate. Modern tests of traditional Ayurvedic mercury preparations have found that many of them contain dangerously high levels of bioavailable mercury. The European alchemists, working in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, were also obsessed with mercury. The great alchemist Paracelsus, one of the founders of modern medicine, believed that mercury was a fundamental principle of matter, along with sulfur and salt. He used mercury in his medical treatments, sometimes with success, sometimes with fatal results. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary substance that could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life, was closely tied to mercury. The stone, it was believed, could be created through a long and complex process involving the purification and combination of mercury and sulfur. The alchemists of Europe, like their Chinese counterparts, were not just con artists. They were serious, if misguided, scientists. They were trying to understand the fundamental nature of matter and life. They failed, but their failures laid the groundwork for the development of modern chemistry. The irony is that the substance they revered as the key to immortality was actually a key to an early and painful death. 220320. Part 4: The Science of Mercury Poisoning. Let us pause and talk about what mercury actually does to the human body, because the reality is even more horrifying than the ancient alchemists could have imagined. Mercury is a heavy metal, one of the most toxic elements on Earth. It exists in several forms, and each form has its own particular type of toxicity. Elemental mercury, the shiny liquid metal, is relatively harmless if you touch it or even swallow it. It passes through the digestive system largely unabsorbed. The danger comes when it is vaporized and inhaled. Liquid mercury at room temperature releases a vapor that is invisible and odorless. When you breathe it in, it passes directly from your lungs into your bloodstream and then into your brain. This is what happened to the hat makers of the 19th century, who used mercury nitrate to soften felt and spent their days inhaling mercury vapor. Hence the phrase "mad as a hatter." The symptoms of chronic elemental mercury poisoning include tremors, anxiety, depression, memory loss, hallucinations, and psychosis. The brain is literally being destroyed by the metal accumulating in its tissues. But the form of mercury that was in the elixirs was often even more dangerous. The alchemists would heat cinnabar to extract the mercury, and they would mix it with other substances. This could create organic mercury compounds, particularly methylmercury, which is one of the most toxic substances known to science. Methylmercury is absorbed almost completely by the digestive system. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It crosses the placenta and poisons unborn children. It accumulates in the body over time, concentrating in the brain, the kidneys, and the liver. The symptoms of methylmercury poisoning are devastating: peripheral neuropathy, loss of coordination, slurred speech, blindness, deafness, cognitive decline, in severe cases, coma and death. The famous case of Minamoto disease in Japan, where an entire community was poisoned by methylmercury and industrial wastewater, showed the world just how horrific mercury poisoning can be. Children were born with severe birth defects. Adults lost their ability to walk, talk, and think. Thousands died, and the ancient Chinese emperors were voluntarily ingesting this substance in concentrated form, believing it would make them immortal. The alchemists were not entirely wrong about everything. Some of their preparations, particularly those involving gold, were relatively harmless. Gold is inert and passes through the body. Some of their herbal additives may have had medicinal properties, but the mercury was killing them. The tragedy is that the symptoms of mercury poisoning, the tremors, the mood swings, the hallucinations, were sometimes interpreted as signs that the elixir was working. The alchemical texts described the death-like state that the elixir could induce, a state from which the adept would awaken transformed and immortal. In reality, the death-like state was a coma, and the transformation was death. The ancient alchemists, for all their intelligence and dedication, were working with a fundamentally wrong model of how the human body works. They believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that the properties of a substance could be transferred to a person who consumed it. Drink liquid metal and become fluid and indestructible. Ingest cinnabar and absorb the fire of transformation. This is not how biochemistry works. But they had no way of knowing that. Part 5: The Tao of Immortality, Religion and Philosophy. To fully understand why the emperors drank mercury, we have to go deeper into the philosophy and religion that underpin the practice. Taoism, one of the great spiritual traditions of China, was the intellectual and spiritual framework for Chinese alchemy. Taoism is a complex and multifaceted tradition, but at its core is the concept of the Tao. The way, the underlying principle of the universe. The goal of the Taoist sage is to live in harmony with the Tao, to cultivate the vital energy known as Qi, and to achieve a state of perfect health, longevity, and ultimately, immortality. The Taoist immortals, the San, were legendary beings who had achieved this goal. They were said to live in remote mountains or on hidden islands, subsisting on dew and magical herbs, possessing the secret of eternal life. They could fly through the air, become invisible, and transform themselves into animals or objects. They were not gods in the Western sense, but perfected human beings who had transcended the limitations of the mortal body. The stories of the immortals were wildly popular in Chinese culture. They appeared in poetry, painting, and folklore. They were the superheroes of the ancient world, and every Taoist practitioner, from the simple hermit in his mountain cave to the emperor and his palace, dreamed of joining their ranks. There were two main paths to immortality in Taoist practice. The first was internal alchemy. This involved meditation, breathing exercises, dietary practices, and sexual techniques to cultivate and circulate Qi within the body. The goal was to create an immortal embryo within the body, a new, perfected self that would eventually replace the mortal self. Internal alchemy did not require the ingestion of any substances. It was a purely spiritual and physiological practice. The second path was external alchemy. This was the path of the elixir. The theory was that just as the body could be transformed from within, it could also be transformed from without by the ingestion of alchemically prepared substances. The two paths were not necessarily exclusive. Many practitioners combined them, but the lure of external alchemy was powerful. It promised a shortcut. Instead of decades of meditation and discipline, you could achieve immortality by taking a pill. For an emperor with a busy schedule and a desperate fear of death, the shortcut was irresistible. The alchemists were not frauds. Well, some of them were frauds, but many of them were sincere, dedicated spiritual seekers who believed they were on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history. They saw themselves as scientists in the modern sense of the word, experimenting with the fundamental building blocks of matter to unlock the secrets of life. They wrote treatises, exchanged formulas, and debated the finer points of alchemical theory. They developed elaborate cosmologies that linked the 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water, to the organs of the body, the planets, and the seasons. Mercury was associated with water, with the kidneys, with the planet Mercury, with the color black, with the north, with the winter. Gold was associated with metal, with the lungs, with Venus, with the color white, with the west, with the autumn. The elixir was a carefully balanced combination of these elemental forces, designed to harmonize the body with the cosmos. The tragedy is that the alchemists were operating in a pre-scientific framework. They had no concept of the periodic table, of atomic structure, of biochemistry. They were brilliant observers of the natural world, but they lacked the tools to understand what they were observing. They saw mercury transform from a solid mineral to a liquid metal to a gas and back again, and they concluded, not unreasonably, that it was a substance of extraordinary power. They were right about the power. They were wrong about what that power did to human tissue. Part 6: The Death Toll Emperors Who Died for Immortality. Let us count the dead. It is a grim exercise, but it illustrates the scale of the tragedy. The list of Chinese emperors who died from alchemical elixirs is shockingly long. We have already mentioned Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, Tang Taizong, the great Tang emperor, Tang Xianzong, Tang Muzong, Tang Wuzong, Tang Xuanzong. But the list does not stop there. Emperor Jiajing of the Ming Dynasty, who ruled in the 16th century, was another Mercury enthusiast. He moved his court to a secluded palace and devoted himself to Taoist alchemy, neglecting the affairs of state. His alchemists prepared elixirs from cinnabar, and the emperor consumed them regularly. He also became obsessed with a peculiar Taoist practice involving the collection of menstrual blood from young virgins, which was then processed and consumed as an elixir. The young women were fed a special diet and their blood was mixed with other ingredients to create a red lead pill. The emperor believed this would confer immortality. Instead, he became increasingly paranoid and reclusive, and he died at the age of 59, almost certainly from heavy metal poisoning. Emperor Yanzheng of the Qing Dynasty, the son of the great Qin Shi Emperor and the father of the Qin Huang Emperor, was also a victim. He was a hard-working, reform-minded ruler who restored the finances of the empire and strengthened the central government, but he was also deeply interested in Taoism and alchemy. He invited Taoist priests to the palace to prepare elixirs for him. He wrote poems about the joy of taking the medicine of immortality, and in 1735, at the age of 56, he died suddenly. The official cause of death was illness, but the circumstances were suspicious. His son, the Qin Huang Emperor, immediately expelled the Taoist priests from the palace and ordered them to never speak of what they had done. The implications clear. The emperor had been killed by his immortality medicine. The pattern is not confined to China. In ancient Egypt, mercury was used in ritual and medical preparations. The Egyptian priests, who were also the doctors and alchemists of their time, were aware of cinnabar and mercury. The famous Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BC, contains recipes that include mercury compound. Whether these were taken internally or used externally is not entirely clear, but the association between mercury and healing was present in Egypt long before it appeared in China. In India, as we have discussed, the Rasa Shastra tradition continues to this day. Ayurvedic medicines containing mercury are still manufactured and sold, despite warnings from modern medical authorities about their toxicity. The belief in the transformative power of mercury is deeply embedded in certain spiritual traditions, and it has proven remarkably resistant to scientific evidence. In medieval Europe, alchemists and physicians used mercury to treat a variety of ailments, including syphilis, which was a new and terrifying disease that swept through Europe in the 16th century. Mercury was used as a topical ointment and sometimes ingested. It did not cure syphilis, but it did produce dramatic invisible effects, including massive salivation, which was interpreted as the disease being expelled from the body. In reality, mercury poisoning causes the salivary glands to go into overdrive, producing liters of saliva a day. Patients would sit with buckets, drooling constantly, while their teeth fell out and their health deteriorated. This was considered a sign that the treatment was working. The logic of sympathetic magic is a powerful and dangerous thing. Part 7. Why didn't they stop? The question that haunts this entire story is a simple one. Why didn't they stop? If every emperor who took mercury elixirs died young and in terrible health, why did the next emperor keep taking them? Why did the tradition persist for over 1,000 years? There are several answers, and they reveal uncomfortable truths about human psychology. The first answer is survivor bias. Put in reverse, the alchemists could always point to someone who took the elixirs and lived, a court official who took a small dose and felt energized, a Taoist hermit who claimed to be 200 years old, a local legend about an immortal who ascended to heaven. The deaths, by contrast, could be explained away. The emperor did not follow the proper diet. He did not perform the necessary rituals. He took the elixir at the wrong astrological time. He was poisoned by enemies, not by the medicine. He was not pure enough of heart. The elixir was prepared incorrectly. There was always a reason, always an excuse, always a way to preserve the belief in the face of contradictory evidence. This is a classic feature of what psychologists call belief perseverance. Once a belief is deeply held, especially a belief tied to identity and hope, people will go to extraordinary lengths to protect it from falsification. The second answer is that the elixirs did produce some effects that, to the pre-scientific mind, seemed positive. Mercury is a stimulant in low doses. It can produce a feeling of warmth, energy, and alertness. The skin flushes, the heart rate increases. For someone who is aging, who is feeling the slow creep of fatigue and decline. This sudden burst of vitality feels like a miracle. It feels like the medicine is working. The long-term effects, the tremors, the dementia, the organ failure, come later. By the time the negative effects become obvious, the connection to the elixir may not be clear. The victim is simply getting old. The alchemists were not entirely wrong to observe that mercury had a powerful effect on the body. They were wrong about the nature of that effect. The third answer is that there was no alternative. The emperors were surrounded by death. Infant mortality was staggering. Plagues swept through cities. Women died in childbirth. Soldiers died in battle. The average life expectancy in the ancient world was around 30 years. To be an emperor was to live in constant fear of assassination, rebellion, and disease. The promise of the elixir, however false, was the only hope available. There was no modern medicine, no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, no vaccines. The choice was not between mercury elixirs and a healthy lifestyle. The choice was between mercury elixirs and nothing. And faced with the terror of death, most people will choose something over nothing, even if that something is poison. The fourth answer is about the structure of power. The emperor was surrounded by people whose entire livelihood depended on telling him what he wanted to hear. The court alchemists were not going to admit that their life's work was a failure. The court officials were not going to risk their positions by contradicting the emperor's deeply held beliefs. The entire system was designed to filter out bad news and amplify good news. If an elixir killed an emperor, the alchemist responsible might be executed. But the idea that elixirs in general were deadly was too dangerous to be spoken aloud. It would be an admission that the emperor had died in vain, that his life had been thrown away on a fool's errand. Far easier to blame the individual alchemist and then find a new alchemist who promised better results. The cycle continued. Part 8: The end of the elixir. The tradition of mercury elixirs did not last forever. In China, by the time of the Qin Dynasty, the practice was in decline. The repeated and very public deaths of emperors had taken their toll. The rise of rational, evidence-based medicine, influenced by contact with the West, began to displace the old alchemical traditions. The last emperors were more likely to consult Western-trained doctors than Taoist alchemists. The elixir of immortality faded into the realm of folklore and legend. In Europe, the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries finally broke the hold of alchemy on the intellectual elite. The work of Robert Boyle, Antoine Lavoisier, and others established the foundations of modern chemistry. Mercury was revealed to be an element, a simple substance that could not be transmuted into gold or immortality. The alchemical dream died, replaced by the cold, hard facts of the periodic table. But the human desire for a shortcut to immortality did not die with it. Today, the elixirs of life are sold in different bottles. They are called anti-aging supplements, life extension therapies, biohacking protocols. Silicon Valley billionaires are investing billions of dollars into research on reversing aging. They are taking metformin, rapamycin, and experimental gene therapy. They are injecting themselves with the blood of young donors, a practice known as parabiosis, which sounds disturbingly like something a medieval alchemist would have tried. Some of this research is legitimate science, some of it is snake oil. The line between the two is not always clear. The promise of immortality, or at least radical life extension, is as seductive as it ever was. The fear of death has not gone away, and the human capacity for self-deception has not diminished one bit. Let me tell you about a modern parallel that is particularly chilling. In the early 20th century, a substance called radium was discovered. It glowed in the dark. It seemed to emit an endless supply of energy. It was hailed as a miracle substance. Radium was added to drinking water, to toothpaste, to cosmetics. It was sold as a cure for arthritis, for impotence, for aging. The radium girls, factory workers who painted watch dials with radium paint and lit their brushes to get a fine point, suffered horrific radiation sickness. Their jaws literally fell off. Their bones crumbled. They died in agony. But the manufacturers knew about the dangers and hid them. The public wanted to believe in the miracle. The radium girls were sacrificed on the altar of hope and profit. The parallels to the mercury elixirs of ancient China are exact. A miraculous new substance, promises of health and vitality, a public eager to believe, a medical establishment slow to recognize the danger, and a trail of bodies left in the wake of a false hope. Even today, mercury poisoning continues. Artisanal gold miners in the Amazon and in Africa use mercury to extract gold from ore. They heat the mercury gold amalgam, vaporizing the mercury into the air and inhaling it. They suffer the same symptoms as the ancient alchemists: tremors, madness, death. The quest for gold, the metal of immortality, still poisons those who seek it. The story of Mercury is not over. It is still being written, in the bodies of the poor and the desperate, in the laboratories of the biohackers, in the dreams of those who refuse to accept that death is the one enemy that can never be defeated. Part 9: The philosophy of immortality. What the emperors could not accept. Let us step back and think about what this story means. The emperors who drank mercury were not stupid. They were not insane. They were human beings, faced with the fundamental human dilemma. We are the only animals who know we are going to die. We can imagine the future. We can project ourselves into it. And we can see, with terrible clarity, that there is a point in that future where we no longer exist. This knowledge is the source of all religion, all philosophies, all art. It is the wound that cannot be healed. The emperors, with all their power, could not accept this. They could not accept that they were subject to the same laws as the lowest peasant. They had conquered nations, built palaces, commanded armies. Surely, they could conquer death. The Mercury Elixirs were not just a medical treatment. They were a philosophical statement. They were a declaration that the emperor was not just a man. He was a god in training, a future immortal, a being who had transcended the limitations of the mortal body. To admit that the elixir did not work was to admit that the emperor was, after all, just a man. That was an admission too terrible to make. The quest for immortality is, at its core, a quest for meaning. If we die and are gone forever, what was the point of our lives? What was the point of our suffering, our striving, our love? The ancient world provided many answers to this question. Some religions promised an afterlife, a paradise where the faithful would be rewarded. Some philosophies taught that the individual self is an illusion and that we return to the great unity of the cosmos. Some cultures celebrated the legacy that a person leaves behind, their children, their works, their memory. The Taoist immortals were one answer among many. They represented the possibility that the individual self could persist, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living, breathing, physical being, forever. That is a powerful promise. It is a promise that speaks directly to the deepest human longing. We want to live. We want to see our children grow up. We want to see the next sunrise, the next spring, the next century. We want to know what happens next. The emperors who drank mercury were not so different from us. They just had the resources and the desperation to act on their longing in a way that most of us cannot, and they paid the price. Today, we look back at the mercury drinking emperors with a mixture of pity and superiority. We know something they did not know. We know about the periodic table. We know about biochemistry. We know that you cannot transmute base metals into gold, and you cannot transmute a mortal body into an immortal one by drinking a cocktail of heavy metals. But are we really so different? The supplement industry is worth hundreds of billions of dollars. People swallow pills and powders every day, convinced that they will extend their lives, improve their health, restore their youth. Some of these supplements work. Many of them do not. Some of them are actively harmful. But the hope that drives their consumption is the same hope that drove Qin Shi Huang to summon his alchemists. The fear of death is a constant of the human condition. The desire to escape it is eternal. The story of the Mercury Elixirs is a cautionary tale. It tells us that we should be humble in the face of our own ignorance. It tells us that we should be skeptical of miracle cures and magical substances. It tells us that the most dangerous lies are the ones we want to believe. But it also tells us something else. Something more profound. The emperors who drank mercury were fools. Yes, but they were also dreamers. They looked at the cold artifact of death and said, "Oh, I refuse." They were wrong about the method, but their refusal to accept the unacceptable is, in its own twisted way, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. We are the animal that will not go quietly. We are the animal that will try anything, even poison, to keep the flame of life burning for just one more day. That is our glory and our curse. Part 10: Closing the Rivers of Mercury. Qin Shi Huang's tomb has never been opened. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after the emperor's death, described it in detail. The ceiling is a map of the heavens, with pearls for stars. The floor is a map of the empire, with rivers and oceans of flowing mercury, mechanically circulated to simulate the movement of water. Crossbows are rigged to fire at anyone who enters. The emperor's body lies in a bronze coffin, surrounded by his treasures. The tomb is one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. Modern surveys have confirmed the presence of high levels of mercury in the soil around the mountain. The ancient accounts, it seems, are true. The man who spent his life searching for immortality now lies in a pool of the very substance that killed him. It is a fitting monument to the strange and tragic story we have explored today. A story of power and fear, of hope and poison, of the desperate and an utterly human quest to live forever. The rivers of mercury still flow, deep beneath the earth, silent and silver, guarding the sleep of the first emperor, and somewhere in those dark currents, perhaps, there is a lesson for all of us. So the next time you hear about a miracle cure, a new supplement that promises to reverse aging, a secret formula that the pharmaceutical companies don't want you to know about, remember Qin Shi Huang. Remember the alchemists with their furnaces and their prayers. Remember the emperors who died young, their minds addled by the very elixirs they hoped would save them. The quest for immortality is not new. It is as old as civilization itself, and it has always ended the same way. Not with a transformation into light, but with a body in a tomb, in a pool of poison, and the quiet, patient victory of death. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of this long and strange journey, you have my gratitude. Please leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Would you have drunk the elixir? Do you think we are any smarter today, or are we just chasing immortality in different ways? Like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you do not miss the next deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. I will see you in the next one.